Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 30th, 2026, and our dear friend, our brother, Colonel Jacques Baud is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi to everybody. Thank you for inviting me again.
Colonel, let me start with one of these articles in New York Times. It mentions the number of American military personnel in the Middle East has exceeded 50,000. And when it comes to these numbers, 4,000, 50,000, 12,000, if the United States decides to invade Iran, to go to one of these, islands in the Persian Gulf, close to the Strait of Hormuz, is that possible with these numbers? Because it's somehow you have to, if I remember correctly, during the war in Ukraine, when it comes to the ground invasion, you have to have some sort of dominance 3 to 1. When you attack, you have. But when it comes to island, that could be different. You capture an island, but sustaining and keeping that island is important as well, and not just capturing in a short period of time and getting a lot of casualties. What is your understanding of the way that Donald Trump is talking about invading, and it seems that they're serious and they're gonna go in that direction?
Well, it depends very much on what the U.S. has in mind and Trump has in mind. As you rightly said, if it's about taking over a couple of islands, and you have a couple of islands in the Strait of Hormuz, like the Lesser Toon, the Greater Toon, Abu Musa, and this kind of small islands, they can probably be taken very quickly by a very small force, and probably they can even be kept for a while with those forces. The same applies to Harg Island. It may probably be possible by some trained units to gain foot on the Harg Island and stay there for a while. The problem is, when you talk about invading Iran, this is a completely different story. Those islands, first of all, if you have them, you have to figure out what you want to do with them. If the purpose of having those islands is to maintain a free traffic on the Strait of Hormuz, I'm talking about the three, the Lesser, Greater Tunb, and the Abu Musa as an example. You can probably stay for a while, but again, the problem is that the Iranians, because of their superiority in terms of missiles and all that, I'm not sure such a force, a U.S. force, can maintain its presence for a very long time. So, and probably they can be decimated very quickly by some. And apparently, Iran is not ready to let such a force to stay for a long time on those islands. So this is certainly on Harg. The problem is slightly different because, of course, this is an oil terminal with huge importance for Iran, by the way, and with the economic significance. Now, my feeling is, and I have read somewhere, I'm not sure if this is the policy, but I would expect, if I were American, that the Iranians would prefer to destroy the whole potential of Harg Island rather than letting the US stay on the island. And in fact, if you think about it, if you have a force that can install itself on the island and keep control over the oil terminals, essentially you have lost this terminal. So therefore, it's the same price for you to destroy everything. So in that case, I don't see exactly what the US is aiming at by keeping those forces, because they may probably it's probably a PR exercise than anything else. We had similar issues, remember, probably at the very beginning of the Ukraine war with the so-called Snake Island, which was a rock just close to the Romanian border, by the way, the Romanian shore. and the Ukrainians took this rock. They had a presence on this rock. They surrendered, and the Russians then left this rock empty. But then the Ukrainians came back and claimed a victory over the Russians by taking this rock back, and the Russians just bombed the rock and in fact annihilated everything on this rock. So we may have something very similar at play in those islands in the Persian Gulf. But when it comes to invasion of Iran, this is a totally different story. And I'm not sure exactly what a force for 50,000, even 100,000 people could even achieve there. Because, first of all, the occupation, it's not just a matter of the force ratio. It's a matter of how you sustain your presence on such a country, because obviously, and especially in Iran, by the way, because it's a huge country, when you have a force that requires a lot of logistics, how can you afford to do that? Um, especially if the Iranians have, as I said, the supremacy or the superiority in terms of missiles and drones and all that. So I'm not sure exactly what the Americans could achieve. They can probably achieve to get here a bridgehead and get some presence, but then I'm not sure they can achieve any significant operational and even strategic success in uh, in Iran. So I think all what we heard, and again, I don't know what's in the mind of Donald Trump, but my feeling is that everything we see at this stage is rather like a PR exercise rather than a real and imminent danger for Iran. It's probably an imminent danger for the US, if I can put it that way, rather than an imminent danger for Iran. The invading Iran requires a huge amount of forces. And remember that the Americans have tried already in 1980 with Operation Eagle Claw, when they had this special operation to rescue the hostages of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. So they had a special operations with several C-130 aircraft and several helicopter for specially designed for special operations, and this operation failed miserably, and that was one of the most and then you can probably still see the remnants of this catastrophe, because some helicopters crashed. One or two C-30 aircraft also crashed in the desert, killing a lot of soldiers there. So and again, I'm not aware because I haven't been in Iran, but apparently the site remains and can be visited to some extent. I don't know exactly. In any case, it shows that with all the power you may have and all the skills of special operations, airborne forces, and whatever, it's very hard to achieve a special operation in such a country. The problem in this case was, among others, there were obviously planning problems. There were also coordination problems within the U.S. force, because they wanted to keep the whole thing secret, and therefore the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and that led to the catastrophe. But an issue that was related to the complexity of this operation was the distances, because Iran is huge. And when you start, they wanted to land their plane in a very quiet place with not too many people to around to see and watch and witness all that. So that means you have to go very far away, and the distances are a challenge in itself. And okay, if the US would like to invade Iran, this would certainly not be the same kind of operation. But you still have some elements of that will affect the invasion, or possible, or let's say a planned invasion, because of the distances, the kind of the terrain. If you look at the map, you would see that the whole shore, I mean, yes, all the part of Iran which is close to the Persian Gulf is very mountainous. That means that in those places, you can have some guerrilla warfare. You can make the life absolutely impossible to any invading force. This is a situation that you barely had in Iraq, which is in essence a very flat country, except in the north, up in the north. But in Iran, that would be a very different story, because to access Tehran, you have to go through a very difficult terrain where it's very easy to ambush and stop vehicles. So I don't see exactly how they would like to do that. It requires certainly hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a huge logistical capability, and of course, under the permanent threat of drones, missiles, short range missiles, and the long range missile. I mean, or the mid range missiles, those who can reach Israel, will continue to be fired. So I don't see exactly what would be the benefit of such an operation. We still don't see the benefit of the operation at this stage, and I'm sure, and sorry, I'm not sure that escalating this operation and trying to convert this aggression into an invasion would be to the benefit of both Israel and the U.S. So
What would be the way out, Carl, in your opinion, for Donald Trump? Because it seems to me as time goes by, Iran is getting, because Iran is defending itself. Iran is not attacking anybody. That's why they're so comfortable with, as time goes by, to defend Iran, and they know what they're doing. But the United States and Israel are attacking, trying to, talking about invading Iran. This is the whole two different scenarios on the part of the United States, on the part of Iranians. But what would be the way out for Donald Trump? He somehow, you see the way he talks about the situation, you see a lot of desperation happening in the way that he's talking about. How what is your understanding of the current situation of Donald Trump and his, sort of, he has made some sort of trap for himself in the West
yeah.
Asia.
Well, same thing for Netanyahu. In fact, both are trapped into their decision, and they are trapped into their arrogance and their hubris, because they expected a very quick success. They expected a very fast victory, and this is not coming. And despite the experience they had during the 12-day war in 2025, they didn't understand or drew the lessons from that 12-day war. And today they are still uh, thinking they may achieve some kind of success. The problem is that the longer it takes, the longer it will be to define what success can be. Because what we see right now in Iran, it's not just the fact that Iran defends itself, but it's also consolidating itself. We see that with time, the population gets more united as before. We see that they are still, because they're not just firing the missiles, they're also producing additional missiles. So this is a kind of the system, the machinery, the military industrial complex machinery is moving ahead in Iran, meaning that they are producing missiles, they are producing things, they're getting more support, um, political support, I mean, from outside, and probably even more technical support. I'm not sure exactly what kind, but I can expect that you may have more support from Russia and in some form from China. But meaning that the Iranians are not isolated and they get less and less isolated. And you see that even in the Gulf, people in the first move, they reacted and said they wanted to fight against Iran. And now they realize that probably this is not the wisest thing to do, and they now call for a dialogue and call for an appeasement in the region. So, and you see the same thing in the US. Basically, the US understands that this was they overestimated the probability of success, and now they are not achieving that. So the thing is that we are now in the same situation as in Ukraine. The obvious solution would be to have talks with the Iranians, but the Trump and his administration is not used to have talks. They impose a solution, and that's exactly what they just made with this 15 points plan. They come, they put the 15 points on the table and say, well, take it or leave it, more or less. That's what they have done for Gaza. This is what they tried to do with Russia last year with those 20 points plan. And it didn't work because now they have adversaries who are able to respond and are confident that they can respond. Therefore, a negotiation today cannot be just a simple a proposal you can't refuse. This has to be a dialogue, and the solution must be done by the two parties in a real diplomatic type of dialogue where both parties say what they want to achieve. The problem is that the more you wait for that, the more Iran will gain influence and the more the US will lose influence. And we see that already, because as of today, this is the US who come up with a plan because they feel they can achieve something, but they want to stop the whole thing. They want to keep their face, and therefore they try to impose something, but they are the ones who try to stop the machinery. And that's exactly the problem, because Iran has basically refused this dialogue, because they say, well, if you want to have a dialogue, you need to come with responsible proposals. And what we want is, and nota bene, it's almost exactly the same thing you have with Russia. They don't want a ceasefire. They don't want just to pause. They want to have a solution. Iran has been threatened since about 3 decades now to be attacked by both Israel and the US. Now, Iran wants to put a final stop to this whole process. And now it has the opportunity. Trump has given Iran the opportunity to achieve a full stop for that. And that's exactly what Iran will strive for. So this is now, the more Trump waits, the more the more Iran will gain advantage, and the less freedom of decision the US will have. And that's we have exactly the same thing with Ukraine. And that's the reason why, nota bene, on both sides, Vladimir Putin said, well, if you don't want to negotiate, no problem. We'll continue. We'll achieve what we want through force. And you have exactly the same answer given by Foreign Minister Arakchi and others in Iran. They say, well, if you don't want to address the fundamental issue of the problem, and if you don't want to go towards definitive peace, then we'll continue. And the price for that, and that's something I said even before the war when we discussed on your channel, that's already more than about 2 months ago. I said, well, the price for an attack, what is then at stake is the existence of Israel, because obviously Iran cannot destroy the US, but it can destroy Israel, and it can destroy probably not the population, but it can make the life in Israel absolutely impossible. And we have already signs of this. So uh, the thing is, the more the US and Israel wait for any political solution, and the more Iran will have a leverage on them. And that's exactly where we are. So, in essence, we may have tactical success from the U.S.-Israeli coalition, in the sense that they can probably destroy a few command centers and things like this, and bomb a few places in Iran. These are tactical issues, but they have no strategic impact. We have seen that, for instance, killing Ali Khamenei was, in essence, a tactical success, but not a strategic one, because it has not influenced the capacity of Iran to make decisions and to continue fighting. So, in that sense, killing Khamenei was a tactical success, but not a strategic one. And Iran, if you look now the balance between the two, you can see that, and as usual, because that's something I have also noticed on the Ukrainian conflict, and you see that in all the wars the West has waged in the last 30 years, we wage wars at tactical level, while others wage war at strategic level. And even the terrorists, in fact, have waged wars at strategic level. It was less successful because, obviously, fortunately, they have less power, but nevertheless, they were not completely defeated. And in fact, it's exactly what we see when we talk about defeating ISIS, for instance. The US never managed to defeat ISIS. It just changed its form. It just changed name. It just changed its appearance. But the spirit of the whole thing has not disappeared. So all the wars we wage are tactical wars. And now with Iran, the US is confronted to a new situation, because it has not exactly a peer, because US is much more powerful if you take the global reach and capabilities of the US. It's obviously much stronger. But if you look just at the Middle East theater, they are in the balance of forces more or less there. So the US is a peer, and even Iran, or even Israel, who used to think that they were superior to Iran, they notice they are not. Meaning that we have here a very balanced theater of operation, if you want. And that's exactly the situation what the US has never had previously in the last 30 years, and probably even more. So now they are confronted with a force they cannot defeat, at least not in the short term. Maybe if this would last for 20 years, maybe, or I may say 20 years, maybe 1 or 2 years, I don't know. But what I mean is that Iran cannot be defeated in a short run, as it was anticipated by the US-Israeli coalition. And that makes Iran much stronger. That makes Iran a very credible actor in the Middle East. And when I say credible actor, that means that now you may have a few Arab countries who understand that it's probably a good idea to have good relations with Iran. And instead of having US bases that attract fire on you, it's probably better to have a deal with Iran. And So that's the situation. So we are uh, US on the path of a strategic defeat and Iran on the path of a strategic victory. We can summarize that way.
Yeah. Carol, I think the key issue, as you mentioned, is these American bases in the Middle East, and many people right now are thinking if some sort of attack is a short period, if it's been 30 days of war, but Iran has simply destroyed basically most radars, most, many of these radars in the Middle East. So what would be the point of putting these bases in these countries? I think many people are asking themselves, in, for example, in Japan, in South Korea, even we had the IFD, the head of IFD talking about the American troops should, leave Germany. Because what is the point of having American troops, American bases in your country if that would bring chaos, problem, instead of giving you some sort of, security? These are huge and important questions that all these nations are asking themselves.
Well, that's a whole question. In fact, I raised already 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, sorry, when Sweden and Finland contemplated and subsequently joined NATO. This is exactly the same question, essentially. Um, the whole thing is that when you have a base on your territory and you allow the US in that case to use those base into a war of aggression, then you by law you can be considered as an aggressor. This is the UN resolution 3314 of December 1974. In this resolution there is what is defined as an aggression. And I think it's Article 3F. I may be wrong, but I think it's the Article 3F that says that when you allow your territory to be used as a base to attack others, then you can be considered an aggressor. And that's something that nobody really realized so far. And now, when we see, for instance, in the first instance, you had Iran responding to the attack by destroying US military assets on those bases. But then you also had attacks on other targets within those territories. And everybody was surprised. And even in the Europe, people said, well, Iran is bombing even those countries. And so the fact of the matter is that once those countries have allowed the US and Israel to use their airspace, to use their bases, and to use their intelligence assets and things like this in order to perform an aggression, they can be considered as aggressors. And therefore, Iran has the right to respond in those territories. And that's exactly why you have Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE um, suffering from that, and Saudi Arabia, of course, because they are in fact aggressors. De jure, that means by law, they are aggressors, even if it was not their planes, but they are allowed to use the infrastructure. So that means that when you realize this, then you should ask yourself what's the purpose of those bases? Because during the Cold War, we have discussed that several times, and we expected, or we we, we were anxious. We had the concern that the Marxist system, the Warsaw Pact, and all that could invade the Western Europe, and you had this face to face between the so-called liberal economic system and the Marxist and let's say communist bloc so to say. And of course, then it would make sense. It made sense to have US bases in Europe, not as bases to attack, but as bases to force the US to be committed. Because during the Cold War, the problem the European had was that if there was a war, they had no guarantees that the US would intervene or support them. The NATO treaty doesn't oblige the member of the alliance to respond altogether in a case of war. They are not obliged. They can choose. The alliance, the purpose of the alliance was to provide a support, a nuclear umbrella. That was the real aim of the whole thing. But it doesn't oblige the US to come with troops. And the problem here is that if the US would reply with atomic bombs in Europe, well, they could just destroy the whole of Europe without suffering the whole thing. So the idea was that US should be committed to some point. They had to have troops as a guarantee. The US, the guarantee was not so much a guarantee to destroy the Soviet Union, but it was a guarantee that the US would be committed to the defense of Europe. That's why you had those presence. And that's why, by the way, after the Cold War, um, when you had those occupation forces that you had in Western Germany, you had the British, French, U.S. Forces as the winner of World War II, and they were present as occupation force. After the end of the Cold War, the French and the Brits withdrew their forces um, from Germany, and the U.S. didn't. But the reason why they didn't is not because, of course, some may say it's because imperialism and all that. But the real reason why the US didn't withdraw their forces is that because the Europeans wanted to keep these forces as a guarantee that the US would be involved in a conflict. And that would then be a kind of commitment of the US to the defense of Europe. And that's the rationale. Now, in the case of Europe, and that's the situation of the Cold War,
So
this is
what is changed that, in the calculation of Europeans that is leading to this sort of arguments right now?
well, today the problem is totally different. Well, today we are trying to revive the idea that Russia could invade Europe and all that. That's the whole thing. This is the whole purpose of this narrative is to keep the US in Europe, to keep that commitment. But in essence, after the Cold War, we could have withdrawn the Americans there, and the same applies to all the other uh, the military presence around the world. I'm not sure that North Korea has still the ambition to invade South Korea. In fact, North Korea has made several attempts to have a dialogue with South Korea. The South Koreans also tried. This was Trump even tried, and that was just prevented by some neocons in the U.S. But during his first mandate, Donald Trump, you may remember, tried to have a dialogue with North Korea. And I think North Korean will welcome such an agreement, or a détente, if you prefer that word. And the same applies to other. Why do you have so large U.S. military presence in Japan, for example? That was certainly the case during the Cold War because of the Soviet Union. Today, the forces in Japan are probably more related to China. But is China really a military threat? Probably not. China is a continental force, is not a maritime force, even if it has now developed a quite substantial fleet in order to protect its own shores because of the threat of the US. But essentially, the issue with China is an economic one, maybe financial, maybe trading, and all that. But you don't, I don't see here military threats coming from China. Uh, Even if we have a lot of propaganda around this. In any case, the fact that the US has the most aggressive stance towards all these countries. So, meaning that when you are the host of such bases and such military presence, you have to expect that you can be considered as an aggressor. And that's definitely true for the Japanese. That's definitely true for all these countries who have accepted military forces on their territory. And that's probably something that will help to reshape the landscape of the Middle East after this conflict. Again, I cannot anticipate that because I don't know exactly what the Americans want to do. But the fact of the matter is that as of today, it has become extremely clear to the whole world that having bases on your territory and allowing the US to do whatever they want on this basis can have implications on your own territory. And this is even more important for much for these countries that today all the adversaries that we have, or the West has, better said, have missiles that you cannot stop. You see, that applies to Russia, that applies to Iran, obviously, that applies to China, that applies also to Yemen. And that's exactly the problem. Now, if you have if you are an ally, an active ally of the US, well, then you expose yourself. And that may be, well, something that helps to reshape the whole relations that you have in the Middle East and the ratio, the balance of forces that you may have at the end of this conflict.
Carl, I think what is happening when it comes to the situation in West Asia and the way that Iran sees the future. Iran doesn't want the United States to be in the region, and they said that to various of these countries, Arab states in the Persian Gulf. But after all, today, as we talk in Iran, they're talking about NPT. So, what is the use of NPT if they cannot protect us from this sort of aggression on the part of Israel, the United States? And they're making in the parliament, I think they're going to vote soon about this. And most probably they're going to leave NPT because the head of IAEA was asked if he sees what's going on, the attack on Iran is against the international law. He avoided to answer that. He didn't answer that. And he said the only way that you can destroy Iranian nuclear program is to nuke them. No, this is the head of IAEA. That people would somehow want him to be a voice of sanity in the whole case, but his seems to be totally the opposite. How do you see the nuclear program and the way that IAEA, the behavior of IAEA in Iran? They're calling him Mossad, CIA agent. They don't care about IAEA anymore. And what do you make of it?
Well, this is the whole issue. In fact, we are back to the whole issue of the world, the international law based order versus the international rules based order. When you have an international law based order, that means that you have a law and everybody must abide by this law. And the mistake we made for decades now with Israel is to allow Israel to have nuclear weapons without being subject to the safeguards of the IAEA. And that, I think, is a big mistake. And here, the IAEA has, in my view, not just the current director, but all the predecessors as well, they carry a lot of responsibility here, because we knew since the very beginning that allowing Israel to have nuclear weapon creates an imbalance in the region that was not so critical decades ago, when Arab countries had not reached the level of development they have today, and therefore we didn't. I mean, nobody bothered about these Arab forces. Today, the problem is very different, because you have, for instance, late Saudi Arabia, for instance. It has no nuclear weapons. It has some nuclear technology, um, and it has also some ballistic missile capabilities. But Pakistan offered Saudi Arabia to provide, in case of war, to provide nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia, and this is without any control of the IEA. So, meaning that we have now some abilities for some countries to get nuclear weapons, even if they are not in the safeguard system of the IEA. The same applies to Iran. I mean, there were some rumors, I don't know if they are substantiated or not, that North Korea could provide nuclear weapons to Iran. I don't know if it's real or not, but it shows that the whole the whole issue of nuclear weapons should be, in my view, ideally. I'm not sure it's technically or realistically possible today, but we should have all the actors around the table and discuss that. Have to renegotiate the whole issue. The NPT was negotiated originally to keep the nuclear power within those. Essentially, they were the winners of the World War II. In reality, the 5P in the UN Security Council, they all were nuclear power. I mean, military nuclear powers, and they wanted to keep that more or less in that circle, and they didn't want to have nuclear weapons that went out of this circle. And today, obviously, and that started with India and Pakistan, by the way, and Israel, of course, North Korea, and also. So we see that we have a lot of actors who have access to nuclear technology. So, in my view, ideally, but again, I underlined twice the word ideally, it would be to take all those who have access to nuclear technology to sit around a table and decide to have a new treaty, and that everybody should abide by this treaty. There were several attempts to bring Israel, because Israel, around of all these countries who have nuclear capabilities today, Israel is the only one who has an extremely aggressive behavior. It's a country that has attacked all its neighbors since 1948. And obviously, this is also a country that has regional ambition, regardless of how big would be the greater Israel or not. It depends. It has this kind of ambition, and therefore
Colonel, sorry for interrupting you. The concept of Israel, because they have the Samson option. When you have a country like Israel behaving like Israel, attacking each and every country in the region, and then because mostly these nuclear weapons are to use to defend yourself, to have some sort of deterrence. But Israel is using them offensively, to attacking countries. If you attack us, we are attacking you, killing you. But if you attack us, we're going to use nuclear weapons against you. This is the problem with Israel. Other countries, I think, we
well,
have
we
normal.
this is it. where, despite the tensions you may have from time to time between Pakistan and India, we have seen that they are extremely rational actors. And even last year, when you had this border issue, well, both reacted in a very rational way, if you want. With Israel, it's obviously different. There are other motivations, even kind of. I mean, it's not exactly religious, but in it has religious roots, if I can put it that way. It's more complex than this in Israel. But in any case, this is a country that is very much unpredictable as to use of forces, nuclear forces or nuclear capabilities. And that certainly, I mean, the international community and especially the US should have put more influence on Israel to convince the different the governments to enter the IEA safeguard regime. But they haven't done that, and today we are with this sword about above the head of the people in the Middle East. And I think more and more now the Middle East and the powers in the Middle East have the ability to respond to Israel. So they have the mean that in the 60s that was not the case. Israel had nuclear power, so they could impose their will to others. But today it's very different because um, if you have Pakistan providing nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia or North Korea or whoever gives nuclear weapons to Iran, Saudi Arabia, that means that Israel can probably launch a couple of nuclear bomb to on Iran, but you just need a couple of nuclear bomb on Israel to destroy completely the country. And they have to realize this. And they also have to realize that this security policy based on the use of force, as I call it usually, this security by confrontation, in my view, should be abandoned in Israel, and they should have a security by cooperation and start stopping thinking that they can impose their will by force, and they can probably achieve better success in the long term by having good relation with their neighbors. And again, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to have a conflict with Iran. So the issue of the NPT for Iran today, and I would say even last year, this is an issue that was already raised, that the US and Israel at that time created the conditions for Iran to withdraw from the NPT. We mentioned that already 1 year ago. Today, it becomes even more clear for Iran that had they a nuclear weapon, probably the relation with the US and Israel would be better. So it's a pity for, if you consider the word proliferation, but proliferation, if it's, and we see that Iran is an extremely rational actor, I'm not so worried about, I would not be worried, let's say, uh, having Iran with nuclear weapons because so far they have behaved as extremely rational. But, and that's probably the solution to bring more rationality in the balance of the whole region. So we probably, and that might be one of the lessons of this conflict, that at the end, because one of the actors, and namely Israel, is irrational and has too much power in under his control, that is probably good to have a real balance of force and having therefore nuclear capabilities in order to be able to deter Israel to use its force, and not just to deter Israel from using nuclear force, but also deter Israel for using even conventional force, because obviously Israel is a country that has only tried to expand itself in the last 80 years or so, meaning that this trend towards expansion is probably not over, and the Israel will continue on that path. And had Israel in front of him adversaries with nuclear capabilities, probably the Israeli would think twice about this strategy. They have a strategy that was established in the 50s, 60s, based on dominance and so on. They could achieve dominance at that time. Today it's different, but it's not. It must not be just different in words. It should also be different in facts, and that is probably why I could expect that Iran could withdraw from the NPT. Remember, there's also something that is very telling. Um, the Iran had, or Ali Khamenei had issued a fatwa against the use and the possession of nuclear weapons. Now he's dead. Now we know that his son, who took over, is a hardliner, and he may revoke that fatwa and issue another fatwa that allows Iran to have that. So, in essence, Israel has just destroyed the only person who was the guarantor of not having nuclear weapon in Iran. So this is the paradox of this situation, and maybe it's having a real balance of force in the region is probably necessary, because there was too much imbalance in favor of the US and Israel, I would say. So,
Yeah. Carl, before wrapping up, I think we've seen something so, in some ways, so positive in Europe since the war against Iran has started. It means that we have a country, for example, at least Spain, staying, on its ground and saying to the United States, no, we're not going to be part of this. We're not going to help you. We're not going to, it doesn't matter. And Donald Trump sanctioned, he said that we're going to sanction you. He said that, the president of Spain said that we don't care because we know what we want. And this is some sort of, policy, a new sort of attitude on the part of Spain, I would say. We haven't seen that before. Do you think this sort of, attitude gonna grow, gonna get stronger in Europe, all around Europe? Because we know that how people are somehow, they're they're not happy with the current situation in Europe, and the way when it comes to the war in Ukraine right now in the Middle East. Basically, both wars are hitting the economy of Europe.
well, first of all, you have to remember that Spain had also kind of had a pilot behavior regarding Palestine, for instance. It also supported vehemently the Palestinians. Now you have to look, and that's the when we talk about Europe, of course, we hear what Brussels says about Russia, 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 and Russia. But if you look at the map of Europe, you will see that those countries who are in the on the Mediterranean Sea, and that applies very much to Spain, which is not a few kilometers away from Africa, has a lot of migrants, has historical relations with African and Muslim countries. The Spain has, of course, other priorities than, let's say, Estonia or Latvia. For Estonia and Latvia, the Baltic states, essentially their attention is focused on Russia. I'm not sure it's very rational, but that's the way they perceive things. And you have on the other side of Europe, at the other in the diagonal of of Europe, You have Spain, which is very close to the Muslim world, who has another perception of this the relations with the other continents, and that explains probably the reason why Spain has to be or is very cautious towards this behavior that we have in Europe with the bad guys and good guys and all that. And that's probably the reason why Spain is considering to have more like a it's probably more like a neutral stance in this conflict. And the example of Spain prohibiting the US to use their air bases in on their territory to attack Iran is just an example of what I said before about Resolution 3314. This is because when you start to allow a country to use your territory or assets in order to attack a third country, you are also an aggressor, and that's certainly not what Spain wants to be.
And
And
Carol, sorry for interrupting you. We had the same sort of issue being raised in Germany. So they're going to be, they were talking about this. If we let the United States, that they're letting the United States using their territory to attack Iran, they're going to be part of, the consequence. They're going to face the consequences of what they're doing. Go ahead.
exactly, and the thing is that this the conflict in Iran has in fact highlighted this problem, because so far it was always the others who were attacking. I mean, Russia attacking and so on. And of course, the situation was much less clear than it has been on the 28th of February, where it was a clear attack out of the blue from the US and Israel. And they even acknowledged that it was an attack, not even, it was not provoked. So now we understand exactly what the Americans, especially under the administration of Trump, because he has this kind of irrational type of behavior that may drag other people into a war. And it's very interesting, by the way, that you may remember 2 weeks ago, as Trump wanted to open or keep open the Strait of Hormuz, he asked several countries to help the U.S. To send their navies let's say to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Then all these countries, after a while, refused because they understood that they would be then dragged into a conflict. And the idea of the U.S. is very simple: they would to put the Europeans on the front line, and then the US would withdraw. And this is exactly what the US has done basically in 2014, 2015 with ISIS. We had just 1 week ago, we had the 10 years, the anniversary of the bombings here in Brussels from the Islamic State. They made some bombings at the Brussels airport and in the subway here 10 years ago. But the reason why it happened is because Belgium had been involved in the conflict in Iraq and Syria. And previous to that, Belgium had never been in the region. So suddenly they were dragged into that. The US asked, and the Belgium followed the French, as they use, as they do habitually. Usually, when the French do something, the Belgium follow very blindly. And the price for this was to have those terrorist attacks. So this is exactly the US wanted, because the US didn't need to have these forces. You see, they didn't need to have them. The European forces in Iraq and Syria made something like 7% of all those strikes. But the US asked, nevertheless, the Europeans to come. So they had somebody else to put on the front line, And in fact, the terrorist terrorist attacks happened in France and Belgium, a little bit in Germany, in Sweden, and all that, but not, oh, you had a few attacks, but only a few in the US. Most of the attacks went in France, as an example. So this is exactly what the US tries. They start a war, they start a problem, and then they ask others to help them, and then they hide behind their allies. And the allies are those who are confronted with the consequences of this conflict, namely terrorism, immigration, and all that. You see, this is exactly the problem. So, U.S. plays a very cynical role there, and the Europeans are stupid and naive enough to play along with the Americans. And obviously, it is even more uh, complex with people like Trump, who can change its mind overnight, and that makes the whole, let's say, crisis management at large extremely complex from a Western point of view, because we never know exactly what will happen. The US starts things, doesn't know how to get out of it, and therefore ask the others to solve the problem. So this is this is the kind of relationship we have today in the West, and that's something we never had during the Cold War. This is very interesting. We never had such a situation in the Cold War. And today we see that this is the U.S. Let's say this trend of the U.S. to make war anytime and everywhere, and so on. And once it's done in Iran, now they want to start in Cuba and things like that. I mean, again, even if Trump was elected with the idea that he would concentrate on the development of his country instead of spending money on all wars. You can imagine that in this first month of war, they spent 50 billion dollars. Now, I saw on a program of a Belgium analyst, and he said, well, with $50 billion, China builds 2,500 kilometers of high speed train. You see? So the money you spend in such stupid war is something you cannot spend for other more useful purposes. And that's exactly the same thing we have in Europe. And because we have elites who are not able to see deep in the future, who have no vision of the future, who react on a day to day basis to things, who have no understanding, proper and deep understanding of the conflicts. We are just getting involved into conflict that have absolutely no sense, that will just make us spend money for things that are totally useless. We just destroy a region instead of building something, and we are not helping anything. You see, if you wanted to have a safe Strait of Hormuz, the best thing to do would have peace with Iran. You don't need to send your cruisers or destroyers or whatever on there. Have good relations with Iran. Stop the stupid sanctions that has provided any benefit to anybody, has just destroyed international trade, has destroyed our potential markets for Europeans or even the US. What is the benefit of having Iran sanctioned? None. Absolutely none. Zero. We didn't even improve our security, since the Americans felt that they had to attack Iran because they felt threatened by a country that has been sanctioned for 40 years. So you see that all we do is nonsense. And therefore, we continue with policies that spend money. And you see that the US has already a huge debt problem. and this will obviously continue with the conflict. And because they are too arrogant to acknowledge that they made a mistake, and it was a bad decision to enter into conflict with Iran, instead of doing so, they will continue, at least for a while, spending even more money and removing that money from where it's needed. We if you look Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, uh, even North Korea, what is the benefit of maintaining tension with those countries? Rationally, what is the benefit? You may like or dislike their governments. Okay, I'm not a communist, and I'm never supported the Marxist government. But it's not my issue. This must be decided by the people there, not me, even if I don't like it. But the fact of the matter is that by maintaining tension with those people, instead of helping them to get out of this kind of government, if they are bad government, um, instead of doing that, we just maintain tension that raise the price of energy. That I mean, we see, and this example here, what we have in Iran today, is just the blatant example of that. I mean, we could have a very affordable price of energy if we had not sanctioned Russia, if we had not sanctioned Iran or whoever. So, what's the point? I mean, we could have the Cold War for 50 years without sanctioning Russia for its oil. Although we were in the Cold War, you understand. We had those forces deployed in Germany at the border to monitor the border every day. We had these raiders and U-2 flights and SR 2071 flying over the USSR and a satellite, and we monitored every single move that you could have in Russia. But and we had even to, you may remember, the KAL 007 in the extreme far east on the Sakhalin island, where you had this Boeing that was downed by the Russian Air Force by mistake, but still downed. In any case, uh, we didn't apply sanctions on Soviet Union at that time. So we were very much rational, understanding, waiting. What is the benefit applying sanctions, and what does it solve as problem? But we are no longer like this. We are totally irrational. We act like children in a primary school. That's all. That's exactly. We want to punish people, and we sanction and sanction and sanction over sanction. We are, which are basically illegal in essence. But this is another topic. So we are not improving the situation. We are just worsening the situation, increasing tensions, and creating situation where, in that case, the price of energy is just mounting and skyrocketing for the benefit of whom? And now we notice that the Iran war just benefits Moscow because of the price of oil. So we are totally contradicting ourselves all the time because we are not able to understand the problems, to find reasonable solutions to the problems. And again, there is no reason to fight against Iran. Iran is not a country that has even tried to expand itself. Even Iraq, I mean, Iraq started a war with Iran with the support of the West, basically, France and the US in particular. Um, so Iraq tried to do that, but under the not under pressure, but let's say the Western countries helped to have this crisis. But in any case, Iran was attacked. It was not the attacker. And I don't understand exactly what is the real problem of Iran in this region. I mean, I see no country today in the Middle East, except Israel, by the way, who could be a potential problem for the regional security. Even Syria has certainly a problem in itself. I'm not sure it has a regional impact. So we what is what do we what is the benefit of intensifying those crises? I don't understand that. But again, probably I'm too rational, and and our leaders are irrational,
Yeah,
and probably
exactly.
will.
That's the case, Carl. I think that's the case.
That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem. Exactly. Thank you, Carl. As always, we learn from you and hope you get rid of these sanctions that we know that they're trying to put a lot of pressure on you as well because of, it's not, it's
Well, we are
unbelievable.
back in the domain of irrationality, and that's it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Carl. Great
Thank
pleasure
you
as
for
always.
inviting me. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.